Then came August of 1914. The newspapers filled with words that seemed too large for print: mobilization, invasion, empire, duty. She read them at breakfast, the sound of horses clattering on cobblestone outside, and felt something shift, not fear, but a pull. By autumn, the hospital had emptied of its young nurses, each one volunteering to go just for a few months. She applied to the Royal Naval Nursing Service and was accepted within weeks. On the morning she left, London was wrapped in mist. She kissed her mother's hand through the carriage window and said, "I'll be home before the leaves fall." It was the same promise she would later find pressed into that ruined letter. The crossing to France was calm, though the sea seemed restless beneath the grey sky. Edith watched the horizon fade, the last outline of England dissolving into the mist, and wrote in her small diary, "The world is breaking apart, and I must learn how to hold it together." When she arrived in Etaples, the scale of it stunned her, tents stretching for miles, the sound of stretchers and coughing, the endless smell of smoke and salt. She unpacked her things in silence: 2 uniforms, a Bible, and a folded photograph of her mother in the garden. That night, as the guns echoed faintly across the channel, she realized the truth. She had not come to save lives. She had come to bear witness. The rain had not stopped since the night she arrived. The ground outside the tents was a slow-moving river of mud, swallowing boots, stretchers, and the names of men before they could be spoken. The hospital lamps burned faintly through the storm, their glow the only proof that order still existed somewhere within the chaos. On her second night in Etaples, the wagons came one after another until the line disappeared into darkness. Each wagon carried what they called the living. By the time they reached the tents, that word had lost its meaning. Edith moved among them in silence, her apron already soaked to her knees. She no longer heard the thunder of the guns. It had become part of the weather. What she noticed instead were the small sounds: a soldier whispering for water, another repeating a woman's name until his voice gave out. She knelt beside a boy no older than 17. His face was pale beneath the dirt, his breath shallow and fast. "You'll see home again," she said. He opened his eyes and managed a faint smile. "Tell my mother I wasn't afraid." When his pulse stilled, Edith closed his eyes and whispered, "You were brave enough." Later, she wrote in her diary, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep breathing while afraid." At dawn, the rain eased. The nurses stepped outside to wash their hands in basins filled with grey water. The sky was colourless, the air heavy with the smell of iron and disinfectant. The matron passed by and said, "You'll grow used to it." Edith doubted that. The mud clung to everything: their boots, their bandages, their thoughts. Even the air seemed to carry it. But she kept moving, because movement was the only way to survive standing still. That evening, she walked to the edge of the camp. Beyond the dunes, the sea stretched endlessly toward England. She imagined her mother sitting by the window in Kent, waiting for a letter that would take months to arrive. The wind smelled faintly of salt and smoke. She took out her diary and wrote one line: "Every heartbeat here is a borrowed one." Then, as the horizon darkened, she folded the page and whispered again the only words that seemed to hold the world together. He was not alone. By early spring of 1915, the ground around Etaples had become a permanent grave of mud. The nurses joked that it would take a miracle to ever dry again, but no one really laughed. The air smelled of rain, medicine, and something unspoken that never left the lungs. One afternoon, after the stretchers had been cleared, Edith was ordered to tidy the personal effects of a soldier who had died during surgery. His name was Private Lawrence Holt, age 21. His uniform was torn, his boots still caked with the red earth of Ypres. Inside the pocket of his jacket, she found a letter folded twice, stained, but still legible. It was addressed to his mother. The handwriting was surprisingly neat, the kind of careful script taught in school before the war. She hesitated before unfolding it, feeling as if she were trespassing on something sacred. "My dear Mum, I'm sorry for worrying you. The food is not so bad here, and the lads keep me laughing. The nights are the hardest, but when the guns stop, I think of you hanging the washing out in the garden. Tell Dad I still carry the watch he gave me. I'll be home soon before the roses bloom. Your loving son, Lawrence." The paper trembled slightly in her hands. The date at the top read March the 10th, 1915. He had died on the 12th. Regulations required her to send the belongings to headquarters, where they would be inventoried and returned to his family with a short military notice. "We regret to inform you," but that night, long after the lamps had dimmed, Edith sat alone at her desk and copied his letter carefully onto a new sheet of paper. She left out the parts about the food and the laughter, keeping only the words that felt like truth: the garden, the roses, the watch. Then she added one final line in her own hand. He was not alone when he passed. He spoke of home with great tenderness. She folded the page, sealed it in an envelope, and addressed it simply: to the mother of Private Lawrence Holt. When she posted it the next morning, she felt a weight she had not expected, a kind of solemn peace, the feeling of having done something quietly right in a world where right and wrong had lost their shape. That evening, she wrote in her diary, "The dead leave more than bodies. They leave unfinished sentences. Perhaps it is our task to complete them." The habit began there not from duty, but from mercy. From that day on, Edith would write one letter for every soldier whose story would otherwise vanish between the mud and the sky. Weeks passed before the first reply arrived. It came in a small envelope with a faint lavender scent, addressed to Sister E. Appleton, Royal Naval Nursing Service, at Tapler's Base Hospital. Inside was a letter written in an elegant, trembling hand. "Dear Madam, I received your kind words about my son Lawrence. I cannot tell you how much they have meant. I knew somehow that he was not alone, but to see it written, to know someone was there, has given me peace I did not think possible. Thank you for giving me back the night's sleep I had lost." The letter ended without a signature. Just a single pressed rose petal fell from the paper when she unfolded it. Edith sat for a long time before refolding the page. She placed it in her diary and wrote beneath it, "The living write to the dead write to the living, and somewhere between, a nurse delivers the mail." After that, more letters came. Some addressed her by name, others simply to the kind nurse in France. A few contained photographs, or small keepsakes: a lock of hair, a ribbon, a faded birth certificate. One mother wrote, "Your letter arrived on the same day as the official one. I burned theirs. I kept yours." She read each in silence, never answering, never needing to. They were not seeking conversation, only confirmation that their sons had been seen. Among the nurses, her quiet habit became known. They teased her gently, calling her the postmistress of heaven. She smiled but never explained. At night, she continued to write sometimes 2, sometimes 10 letters before the lamps were extinguished. Her handwriting grew smaller, neater, more deliberate. Each word chosen with the same care she used to close a wound. She did not think of it as comfort, but as duty to ensure that no one's child disappeared into the vast, unrecorded silence of the war. One evening, she showed a letter to her friend Mary Collins, another nurse from Yorkshire. Mary read it and said softly, "Do you ever worry that we are lying?" Edith replied, "No, we are telling the truth, just not all of it at once." When she blew out the lamp that night, the scent of lavender still lingered on her hands. By autumn of 1915, word of Sister Appleton's letters had begun to spread quietly among the soldiers. Men spoke of her in the same low voices they used for prayer, as if naming her too loudly might break the spell. They called her the nurse who writes to mothers. Some came to her bedside not for medicine, but to ask a simple favor. "If I don't make it, would you tell her I thought of home?" She never refused. She kept a small notebook in her apron pocket filled with names, regiments, and the briefest of promises. Blue eyes liked fishing, had a laugh like a bell. Nothing official, only fragments of humanity that might otherwise vanish. The number of letters grew until they covered her desk like fallen leaves. She wrote at dawn, at dusk, between shifts, sometimes by the flickering light of a single candle when everyone else had gone to sleep. Her handwriting changed tighter, faster, as if each word had to escape before the next shell landed. She always ended the same way. He was not alone. When her friend Mary Collins teased her for the repetition, Edith smiled faintly. "Because it's the only truth I can promise," she said. One night, after a particularly heavy bombardment, an officer brought her a list of casualties to confirm. As she scanned the names, she recognized several she had already written letters for men she thought had survived. The ink on their previous letters was barely dry. She felt something shift inside her then, a weariness deeper than fatigue. Yet she kept writing, not out of duty anymore, but out of defiance, a refusal to let oblivion win. Sometimes, weeks later, a reply would arrive from home, short notes from mothers and wives written in pencil that had faded almost to dust. "Thank you. I read your words aloud to his photograph. You gave me the courage to believe he mattered." She kept every one of them in a wooden box beneath her cot. It was not regulation to do so, but by then, neither was hope. In her diary, she wrote, "The world is ending one letter at a time. I cannot stop it, but I can slow the forgetting." That winter, the nurses began referring to her desk as the other ward. It held no patients, only names, but in its own way, it was saving lives too. The winter of 1916 arrived early. carried by a wind that scraped the tents bare of color. The air smelled of metal and damp canvas, and every breath seemed to hang in the cold before falling back to the ground. One afternoon, an ambulance stopped outside the ward with a single passenger, a young lieutenant brought in from the front lines near Arras. His uniform was shredded, his left arm bound tightly in bandages, and the side of his face was blackened by powder burns. He refused the stretcher, insisting on walking inside. When Edith helped him to his cot, he studied her name tag and said quietly, "You're the nurse who writes the letters." She hesitated, unsure how to answer. He smiled faintly, though his eyes were tired. "We talk about you out there. Some men say you give their mothers peace. Others say you make dying sound easy." The words struck harder than he meant them to. Edith looked down at her hands, the same hands that had written 100 letters. "I don't make it easy," she said softly. "Only bearable." He turned his head toward the ceiling. "My friend died beside me last week. I told him I'd seen one of your letters." He laughed and said, "Tell her to make mine sound beautiful." His voice broke slightly. There was nothing beautiful about it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rattle of the canvas walls in the wind. That night, after the lamps were out, Edith sat at her desk and opened her diary. "Tonight, a soldier asked if my letters are lies. I do not know the answer. Perhaps mercy and truth cannot live in the same sentence." The next morning, the lieutenant called for her. "Would you help me write my own?" he asked. She brought him paper and a pen. His right hand trembled from the wound, but he managed a few sentences. "Dear Mother, I'm still here. Not whole, but here. I think often of the garden and the smell of coal on cold mornings. If I don't return, know that I remembered the warmth." When he finished, he looked up and said, "Would you read it for me? I can't hear my own voice anymore." She read it silently, then folded it and sealed it for him. "It's a good letter," she said. He smiled faintly. "Good enough to make you write another when it's my turn." She didn't answer. That night, she wrote one of her own, not to a mother, but to herself. "If I am lying, may the lie be kind. If I am telling the truth, may it not destroy." Outside, snow began to fall, soft as ash. The guns were quiet for once, but she could no longer tell whether that silence was peace or exhaustion. The snow had turned to rain again by the time the telegram arrived. It was handed to Edith on a grey morning, folded twice, the edges soft from the messenger's damp gloves. She knew what it was before she opened it. Everyone did. "Mother gravely ill," return advised. 5 words, that was all. She read them once, then once more, and folded the paper neatly before placing it in her pocket. The matron watched her face, waiting for a reaction, but Edith only said, "There are still patients waiting." The day passed like a blur. She cleaned wounds, changed dressings, wrote down names that might never be spoken again. Each action performed with perfect steadiness, as though her body had remembered what her mind could not. That night, she finally allowed herself to sit alone. The telegram lay on the table beside her lamp. She unfolded it again, her eyes tracing the familiar loops of the telegraph operator's handwriting. The words looked colder now. She took out a blank page and began to write. "My dearest, the sea is loud tonight. The wind shakes the tents, but the lamps are holding. I think of you each time I boil water for tea, though I have none to pour. I wish I could be there to see the roses bloom again. If this letter reaches you, know that your daughter has not forgotten gentleness." She stopped. The ink had begun to pool at the edge of her pen. She folded the paper but did not seal it. There would be no way to send it. The following week, another letter came. This one bore her sister's handwriting. "Mother passed peacefully last Sunday. She asked for you." Edith read it slowly, her lips moving without sound. When she finished, she placed both letters side by side on the desk, the one she had written and the one she had received. Then she blew out the lamp. The next morning, she rose before dawn and began her rounds as usual. Her colleagues noticed the change only in her handwriting. It had grown smaller, tighter, as if each word were trying to hide. In her diary, she wrote, "I have written so many letters for the dying, yet now there is no one to write mine. The silence feels heavier than the guns." That night, when the lamps flickered and the wind pressed against the tent walls, she whispered softly into the dark, "He was not alone, but I am." It happened without warning. The sky had been clear that evening, a cold blue fading into violet, when the first siren began to wail across the base. At first, the sound seemed distant, unreal, like a whistle carried on the wind. Then came the planes. The roar grew until it filled the air itself. The ground trembled, the lanterns swung violently, and somewhere outside, someone shouted, "Take cover!" Edith was already moving before the words reached her. She pulled a blanket over a wounded man's chest just as the first blast hit. The shock threw her to the floor. The tent walls rippled like sails in a storm, then collapsed inward. Smoke and dust poured through every opening, thick and choking. Someone screamed for light. Another voice answered, "It's gone!" Edith groped through the darkness until her fingers found the lantern. Its glass cracked but still burning. She held it high, its flame trembling but alive. With that single glow, she began checking the cots one by one, pulse, breath, pulse again. The air was a tangle of sound, coughing, the snap of burning canvas, the muffled thunder of explosions farther off. She worked by instinct. Bandage, move, cover, lift. Her world had narrowed to the small circle of light she could protect. When the bombing finally stopped, the silence felt heavier than the noise. The tents were torn open, their poles splintered, the earth littered with glass and ash. She stepped outside and saw what had once been the ward now, only a skeleton of smoke and flame against the horizon. Her desk lay overturned, papers scattered like white feathers in the mud. She knelt among them, gathering each sheet with shaking hands. Some were burned around the edges, others soaked through with rain and blood. They were the letters, dozens of them, half finished, half destroyed. She spread them out on the ground, pressing them flat, whispering as she worked. "You'll reach them somehow." Her friend Mary found her like that, sitting in the ruin, her face streaked with soot, her hands black with ink. "Come inside, Edith," Mary pleaded. "It's not safe." But Edith only said, "They trusted me with their words." When the dawn came, the fires were still smouldering. The sea beyond the dunes was grey and still, as if it too had been silenced. Edith sat at what remained of her desk and found a scrap of unburned paper. On it she wrote, "If this is the end, tell my mother I tried to stay steady." She left the page unsealed, weighed down by a shard of broken glass. Later she wrote in her diary, "We rebuilt the tents before breakfast. The living were waiting, and that was all. No mention of fear, no mention of loss, only the steady continuation of duty, the quiet rhythm of a heart that refused to stop." The weeks after the bombing passed in a haze of rebuilding. The nurses worked from dawn until the lanterns guttered, stitching new canvas to old, scrubbing blood from wood that would never come clean. The smell of smoke clung to everything, even the rain couldn't wash it away. Then one morning, an ambulance arrived carrying 3 soldiers from the northern line. 2 were unconscious. The third was awake, though barely a boy whose uniform hung loose on him like an older brother's coat. His tag read, "Private Samuel Kerr, Manchester Regiment, age 19. But Edith knew instantly he was younger, 17, perhaps 16 at most. When she touched his wrist, he startled, his eyes clear but dazed. "Am I home?" he whispered. She smiled faintly. "Not yet, but you're safe." He nodded, satisfied, and closed his eyes again. His breathing was shallow, each breath shorter than the last. She stayed beside him through the night, listening to the slow fading rhythm. Near dawn, he opened his eyes once more and said, "Tell her." I didn't mind. By the time the sun rose, he was gone. The cot beside him was already occupied by another wounded man. The war left no space for mourning. Edith folded the boy's blanket, placed his tag on top, and wrote his name carefully in her ledger. That evening, she sat at her desk with a blank sheet of paper before her. She wrote the first line, as she always did. "To the mother of Private Samuel Kerr." Then she stopped. The pen hovered above the page. For a long moment, she could not move. The words that had once come so easily refused to form. Everything she might have written felt dishonest, even mercy seemed like intrusion. She tried again and again, but each time the same emptiness met her. Finally, she folded the blank paper and slipped it inside her diary. On the cover, she wrote one short note. "This one I'll keep." That night, she dreamed of a railway platform. Rows of mothers stood silently, holding photographs instead of suitcases. No train ever came. Only the wind passed through, scattering ashes like snow. When she awoke, the sound of rain against the tent was soft, almost tender. She rose, washed her hands, and went back to work. The letter remained unwritten, but for the first time she understood that silence, too, could be a form of truth. In her diary, she wrote, "There are things too sacred for paper." The guns began to fade that spring. Their thunder, once constant as breath, grew distant, replaced by the sound of gulls and the slow creak of wagons over drying mud. The nurses called it the season of pretending. The soldiers smiled again, talked about home, wrote lists of things they would do when the war was finally over. But beneath the surface of hope, another kind of death was gathering. It began with a cough, one patient, then 2. By April, entire wards were filled with men burning with fever, their faces flushed dark red, their lungs heavy, their voices whisper-thin. The doctors called it influenza. The men called it the ghost. It moved faster than any army. It did not wait for battle orders or ceasefires. The nurses worked until their hands cracked from washing, until their own lungs ached from the smell of carbolic and sweat. Edith wrote in her diary, "The air itself has become our enemy. We cannot defend against it, only endure." Her letters changed. Gone were the gentle reassurances, the phrases she had written hundreds of times. He was peaceful. He was not alone. Now her sentences were shorter, quieter, stripped to their essence. He slept. He stopped suffering. He is at rest. One afternoon, she found her friend Mary Collins asleep at her desk, her head resting on a pile of medical forms. When Edith touched her shoulder, her skin was hot. By nightfall, Mary was gone. Edith did not weep. She simply moved Mary's notebook to her own desk and continued writing. The letters multiplied again, faster than she could send them. The war might be ending, but the dying had not. Outside, spring flowers bloomed across the dunes, small clusters of violets that pushed through the cold soil as if in defiance. Edith began tending one near the entrance of the ward. Each morning she poured a little water from her basin over it before her rounds. When the first petal opened, she wrote in her diary, "Hope is not the opposite of despair. It is what remains when despair is finished." By May, the worst of the illness passed. The guns were silent for longer stretches now. And yet, even in that silence, she heard something, the echo of all that could not be written, all that had been lost between the mud and the sea. That night, as she looked out over the camp, the horizon glowed faintly orange with distant fires, and for the first time in years, she let herself believe that peace might come. On the morning of November the 11th, 1918, the guns finally stopped. It happened so suddenly that no one believed it at first. A long silence spread across the fields, deeper than any that had come before. Men stood frozen, unsure whether to cheer or listen. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if waiting for confirmation. Then, somewhere down the line, a soldier began to laugh, a wild, broken sound, and others joined him, their voices rising and falling like waves. Church bells rang from villages half in ruins. Whistles blew. People wept openly. But in the hospital, the work did not stop. The wounded still needed tending. The dying still whispered for their mothers. Peace had come, but not to everyone. That evening, Edith sat alone at her rebuilt desk. The lamp burned low, its flame steady. For the first time in 4 years, she had no letters waiting to be written, no names on her list, no unfinished sentences. The quiet was unbearable. She opened a fresh page in her diary, then took out her best pen, the one she had kept since before the war, and began to write, not to any one person, but to them all. To every mother who waited by the window, to every wife who counted the days, to every sister who kept the photograph beside her bed, I have seen your sons. They were brave, yes, but more than that, they were kind. They spoke your names, even when they could no longer breathe. They held on to small things, a button, a ribbon, a scrap of home, as if those things could still save them. They believed in morning, even when the night refused to end. And when they went, they were not alone. You were with them, in every heartbeat that remembered love. When she finished, she did not sign her name. She only dated it. Etaples, France, November the 11th, 1918. Then she folded the page, placed it carefully inside an empty envelope, and sealed it with a single drop of wax. On the front, she wrote one word, home. She walked outside. The camp was quiet now, the sky washed clean by rain. Somewhere in the distance, a band was playing a slow tune, not of victory, but of release. She stood for a while, listening, the letter held gently in her hand. When the wind rose, she let it go. The envelope lifted, turned once in the air, and drifted toward the sea. She watched until it disappeared beyond the dunes. In her diary that night, she wrote, "The war is over, but the letters will never stop." It was nearly 30 years later when someone found the trunk. The war had ended, another had begun and ended again, and the world had changed its maps more than once. The hospital at Etaples was long gone, its fields turned to grass and quiet. But in a small cottage on the Sussex coast, an old attic door was opened for the first time in decades. Inside, beneath a quilt and a stack of yellowed newspapers, lay a wooden trunk bound with tarnished brass. The label on its lid was faded but still legible, E. Appleton Nursing Service. When the woman who owned the house pried it open, the smell of dust and paper filled the air. Inside were bundles of letters, tied with thin blue ribbon. Some were addressed, some blank, some burned at the corners as if rescued from fire. Beneath them lay a small leather-bound diary, its pages nearly full. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, unhurried. The first page read, "This book belongs to Edith Appleton, Royal Naval Nursing Service." The entries spanned 4 years from 1914 to 1918, each dated with precision. They were not stories of battle, but of faces, gestures, words whispered before sleep. The diary spoke of things no history book recorded. The color of a soldier's eyes, the way a letter smelled of lavender, the sound of rain hitting canvas when the guns paused. At the very back of the diary, pressed flat between the last pages, was a single envelope. The wax seal had cracked, but the word on the front remained. Home. The woman unfolded it carefully. Inside was the letter Edith had written on the morning the guns fell silent, her final letter, addressed to no one and to everyone. The ink had faded, but the words were still readable. When she reached the line, "They believed in morning," even when the night refused to end, she stopped reading. For a long time she simply sat there, listening to the distant sound of waves against the shore. Later, she placed the letter back into its envelope, retied the ribbons, and carried the trunk downstairs. "It should not stay hidden," she said softly to her husband. "These are not just letters, they're proof someone remembered." Months later, the diary and letters were given to a local archive. A curator there called it one of the quietest acts of courage ever preserved. And so, after decades of silence, Edith's words traveled once more, this time not through war, but through history. The letters went on display in London in the spring of 1965. They filled a single glass case in the Imperial War Museum, one desk, one lamp, one trunk, and 100 envelopes, arranged in careful rows like a field of names. The title of the exhibit was simple, Letters for the Lost. Visitors came quietly. Most spoke little. Some brought their children, others came alone, their coats buttoned against the drizzle outside. They leaned close to the glass, reading words written half a century earlier in a nurse's steady hand. One letter, addressed only to the mother of Private Lawrence Holt, had a faint rose petal still pressed inside. Another bore a line many paused to read twice. He was not alone. An old woman in a grey hat stood before that one for nearly 10 minutes. When she finally turned away, her eyes were bright. "I think she must have written one for my brother," she said softly to no one in particular. Across the room, a veteran of the Western Front, now bent and slow, lifted his hand against the glass as if greeting a familiar face. He whispered, "I remember her." The curator kept the room silent on purpose. No music played, no narration filled the air, only the quiet shuffle of footsteps and the faint hum of light bulbs. The silence became part of the exhibition itself, a space where words could finally be heard. At the end of the display, a small placard bore Edith's own handwriting, enlarged and framed. "Hope is not the opposite of despair. It is what remains when despair is finished." Below it, visitors began leaving their own letters, notes of thanks, of remembrance, of apology. By the third week, the museum had to add another box to collect them. A teacher wrote, "My students read her words aloud in class today." One cried. The others listened. That's how history should sound. And in that way, the letters continued their journey, not across the sea this time, but across generations. They had survived mud, fire, and forgetting. Now they lived again, in the hush of a museum hall, in the trembling hands of those who read them. The exhibition closed after 6 months. The final visitors left as the evening light faded across the museum's tall windows. The letters were gathered carefully, one by one, placed back into their archival boxes. The curator, a quiet man named Thomas Reed, stayed behind to oversee the closing. As he checked through the final inventory, he noticed one envelope that had not been displayed. It was tucked between the back pages of Edith's diary, sealed with brittle red wax. On the front, in her careful handwriting, it read simply, "To whoever reads these words next." He hesitated before breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink faded but clear. The letter read, "If you are reading this, the war is long over. I hope you live in a world where letters are no longer needed to tell mothers their sons are gone. You may wonder why I wrote so many. It was not for pity, nor for history. It was to remind myself that even in the darkest noise, gentleness still matters. We are taught to measure wars by victories and losses, by miles gained and bodies counted. But I have seen that the truest measure lies in the quiet, in the hand that does not let go, in the word that chooses kindness when silence would be easier. If you have found my letters, then perhaps they have done what they were meant to do, to be open not by the past, but by the future. Remember this: humanity is not erased by war. It is revealed by it. Thomas folded the paper slowly, his fingers trembling slightly. He placed the letter in a new envelope and labeled it for preservation. Then he stood by the window for a long time, watching the city lights flicker like stars below the rain. The next morning, he added one final note to the museum's catalogue. The last letter was never delivered. It did not need to be. Years later, visitors still paused before that display: the trunk, the lamp, the handwriting. Some whispered, some smiled, some left in silence. But all of them carried something away: the certainty that words, even small ones, can outlive every war.